Hello, this is Dr. Todd Shaw with class POLI 567, American Local Government. And I am doing topics 8 and 9 lectures on the issues of public financing and economic development in local government. This is Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, and this is a copyrighted lecture, intellectual property. So, in order to discuss the question of public financing and economic development, and as you know, class, I'm combining sort of two broad topics that deal with economics and the economy into one, but I think they flow together. In this lecture, I want to do the following. I have sort of two interrelated objectives. One is to understand the operations and problems of the municipal finance system, as well as the motives, problems, and opportunities cities have in generating viable economies through economic development. I have some dynamic music in the background because to portray a subject that at some point you might find, well, that's interesting, but that's a little mundane. But actually, it's a very important set of topics, and we've been talking throughout the class about how mayors and various city council members care a lot about what occurs in their cities in terms of economic development and job growth, that no mayor or no member of the city council can disregard these questions. And so what are the various economic issues that cities confront? And of course, you know, I use the term city in the broad sense, in the sense of local government. So let's discuss the federal system and municipal finances, because the federal system sets up the broader framework in which these municipalities, counties, local governments exist and how they operate. Then we'll talk about bonds, debts, and the ratings game, and how cities borrow money, how the interest they have to pay, their credit worthiness, all matter. Cities, like individuals, have credit ratings, and so that's part of the consideration of when they go to borrow money, of how much they have to pay back lenders. And of course, cities have to borrow money, or they feel compelled to borrow money because their various sources of revenue are not sufficient for growth projects, for expansion, for new building, for redevelopment. Then we'll talk about various case studies where things went wrong, when they brought about a certain level of fiscal crisis confronted the city, when their revenue and their expenditures did not match up, when their expenditures exceeded their revenue, when their debts became due in problematic ways, and the city was in some ways teetering a bit on the brink. Then we'll talk about economic development, and we'll conclude by discussing regime theory once again. I began with regime theory at the beginning of the class. We'll end with it as a final critique of regime theory. Okay, so now here's a picture of the Federal Reserve building, and the Federal Reserve in the National Federal Reserve system is a system centered in Washington, but it has various Federal Reserve banks around the country in various regions. It's governed by a board of governors, and this board of governors is an independent system, independent from Congress, independent from the president, that sets the rates of federal interest relative to borrowing, and it loans money to banks, essentially lend from the Federal Reserve at a particular rate of interest, and the banks pass this rate of interest on to the broader economy. So it's a system that's sort of set up to guarantee fiscal stability in our economy. The federal system, over the course of the 20th century, the relationship between the federal and state governments developed from a system of sort of dual federalism, or sort of distinct responsibilities and sovereignty at one point. The idea was that there were a certain realm of things that the federal government did, like national defense, and things that local government did, such as, schools and maintenance of roadways. So they were very distinct up until sort of the early 20th century, and we've talked in previous lectures about the ways in which President Franklin Roosevelt changed the system. But we went from dual federalism to one of cooperative federalism, sort of collaborative and with shared responsibilities. Both the federal government and state and local government taking on a range of responsibilities. So state and local government sort of provide the bulk of expenditures on important civil functions, and that's still true today. Whether it be from the fact that the vast majority of courts in the United States are state and local courts. Of course, the school systems are rooted in state and local school systems and systems of higher education and in public schools. There's just a range of responsibilities that states and local governments take on, even within the federal framework. And one set of considerations is how much do states generate relative to revenue versus income. Whereas revenue involves unencumbered funds generated with interest, for instance, taxes versus bonds, income is the total range of funds at the disposal of a government. So you can generate, revenue might come from taxation, but income might be both that taxation as well as any ways in which states take in fees. They may take in, and they may certainly take in money that they've loaned versus that are in the form of bonds. And we'll get to a discussion of exactly what is entailed in states and particularly local governments borrowing money and creating bonds. Then municipal revenue and income, it's important to kind of think very concretely about what do municipalities have to do in order to generate revenue, but also to consider when to loan, when to take in broader income beyond the revenue they can generate. And there's a difference between what state and local governments do versus what's true for the federal government. Let me say that again. The difference between what states do versus what local governments do. Whereas state governments rely predominantly on the federal government and secondarily upon sales and gross receipt taxes. Now, when I say rely predominantly, in that sense, I mean one of their major sources of broader income come from the sources from the federal government. For instance, the Medicaid system, the Medicare system. Those funds are often a huge bulk of what comes into a state government budget, particularly, of course, in the area of health and human services. So that's one way in which there's this strong fiscal relationship between the federal government, or budgetary relationship between the federal government and state governments. But local governments rely predominantly on intergovernmental aid. They are aid from state government and secondarily upon property taxes. Now, we're going to discuss the concept of property taxes or reliance on property taxes and why property taxes are sort of less flexible or less elastic. Meaning, what do I mean by elasticity or flexibility? Meaning that as you have an increase in that resource, you have an increase in the amount of revenue that comes from that resource. Let me give you an example. There's only so much property that to go around. There's only so much land. So it's not like land expands when the economy expands. The only way in which you can increase it without increase property taxes, you have to increase the property rate. It's not like more land is created in order to create more property taxes. It's the same amount of land, you just increase the rate of taxation. Again, we'll get back to that concept. All right, so here I'm showing you, and this is coming from the South Carolina Department of Revenue. these two sets of data. One that came from a previous tabulation from a fellow scholar, and the other one, the 2015 numbers, are the ones I tabulated. And what I simply want to show you in this table, I know it's a little busy and we'll review it in class, but I want to stress to you that what counties, cities, and school districts do can vary, and particularly in the sort of major revenue sources of each of these local governments. And here I'm using the term revenue a little differently, and I'm using sort of revenue and income sort of interchangeably. But actually, no, actually, I am using actually revenue. These are sources that come strictly from government, not from bonds or lending or interest or lending outside of the sources that the government creates and generates. So that first line, well, of course, I have the columns of counties, cities, and school districts, and in each, I'm showing you a comparison between 1997 and 2015. Then on the extreme left side, with the various rows, I'm showing you was this revenue generated from an internal source or an own source of the local government? You know, the various ways in which they can generate income through taxation, through user fees, through local tax options, etc. Income taxes, if cities charge them, they don't in South Carolina, but in other cities they can. Other local governments might actually have income taxes, etc. And so that's the total of the sources within, you know, their own source of revenue. Then under that you have property taxes. Now property taxes is a category I added, which is simply a part of that own source. But I wanted to break property taxes out to just give you a comparison. Then you have state revenues, federal revenues, and interlocal revenues. In other words, we've talked a lot about, mentioned the Columbia Metropolitan Convention Center, which is really a collaboration between various cities, West Columbia, Casey, the city of Columbia. You know, how do those three cities split the revenue that are generated from rental fees and various other fees that come into the convention center? So those are called what you would consider interlocal revenues generated among cities and counties, and in cooperation with each other. So the big takeaway, but we'll come back to this. The big takeaway I want you to look at this or see from this is the conclusion I have down there in green, which is South Carolina local governments, counties, cities, and school districts have had to rely less on state aid and revenue and more on their own sources, federal sources, and sometimes other local revenue. So we'll discuss this, and this is not just unique to South Carolina. We might do it uniquely, but it's not unique to us. In the sense that state governments have undergone sort of economic shocks, they've undergone sort of political shifts and policy shifts, so that state governments are funding local governments less and less, and whether they be counties, whether they be cities, and particularly school districts. So how have these districts, how have these cities, how have these counties made up for that lost revenue from their state governments? We'll talk about that more. All right, so let's talk about sort of, that was true of South Carolina. What's true for the local or municipal government across the nation? And so this particular figure is coming from the work of Pajano in chapter 5 of the publication by Pajano. And we're looking here at three sort of lines. It gets a little muddy here. Let me point you to three particular lines. One being how much have property taxes been a share of municipal revenues, then user fees and charges, and intergovernmental transfers. In other words, to what degree state governments and federal governments have helped to fund municipalities or provided funds to municipalities. And so you can see as that dark property tax line has gone down, and we'll discuss sort of the politics of property taxes. Property taxes are not popular taxes at all, and as those property taxation has come down, you can see the other lines have increased, at least modestly, even though they've tapered off. So you see that user fees and charges, particularly in that period of the 1970s where property taxes were plummeting, user fees were increasing. And what would be a user fee? For instance, a user fee would be if you had a local toll road and you were charging people for driving on that particular bridge or on that particular street. So that would be a user fee. Another example of a user fee would be if people are riding the bus, the fee that you charge them to hop on the bus. So those types of fees have increased pretty exponentially, particularly since the 1940s, and so have intergovernmental revenues, but those intergovernmental transfers have tapered off, particularly in the 1980s, and this is sort of the Reagan revolution of devolution of less federal funding overall and more programmatic shift to state and local governments. Okay, then here are the major revenue sources by region, and this is these are 2002 numbers, and this is from a chapter from Benton's work, chapter 4. And one big takeaway as you look at intergovernmental transfers, you can see that the regions differ in their reliance on various sources of revenues. So with intergovernmental transfers, New England and the mid-Atlantic states differ in the amount of reliance they have on their state governments and the federal government as compared to the North Central, the Midwest, the South, and the West. So it's interesting that the five major regions of the country, you have that split between New England and Mid-Atlantic states that clearly it's likely that their state governments are providing a larger share of their budgets than is true for the North Central, the South, and the West. And you and I we've been talking throughout this semester about differences among the regions as how they structure their governments, and clearly now how they fund their local governments. Then own source revenues, North Central, the West, the South, and the West clearly rely more on their own sources than is true of the New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. Property taxes, you can see property taxes are a whopping share of the sources of New England. And so property taxes in New England states are probably quite high, right? As compared to them tapering off quite a bit in the Mid-Atlantic, the North Central, the South, and the West. And this isn't the rate of property taxes. This is let me go back and be clear. This is the percentage that these sources make up of the total budget of each local government. Okay? New England states really have no other taxes, and so Mid-Atlantic, North, Central, South, and West have to make up for the lesser percentages on the more extreme left side of the column. And then you have user fees, again, pretty whopping in the North, Central, South, and West as compared to New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. Okay, hope you find that pretty interesting. So let's get down to a really sort of important detail, but a particular detail for you to understand a little bit more of the system of public financing, and particularly for local governments. And I want to just explain one particular concept called a millage or a millage rate. What is a millage or millage rate? Millage rate is a tax rate that's applied to the assessed value of real estate. So they say, here is a specific rate we will use in terms of taxation, let's say per acre of land, per acre of property in this particular county or in this particular city. And millage rates are expressed not as regular percentages, but in tenths of a penny. For example, a millage rate of 2 mills would mean 2/10 of a penny of taxation. And so, now many years ago, well, not many years ago, but I think it was roughly about 3 years ago, there was this discussion and a ballot initiative here in Richland County around the penny tax. And it was put in ordinary language, calling it an increase of a penny in taxation. Really what they were talking about were millages, so 1 millage. And the idea was to generate this additional revenue, a couple of $1 million, quite frankly, in order to expand bus services. Well, the penny tax didn't pass. It did not pass as a local referendum. And so it didn't go through, but it was a sort of local discussion here recently about increases in millage rates. So here I'm giving you from again the State Department of Revenue. I'm giving you a chart on the left side of millage rates within Richland County, and you don't have to think about the sort of specific detail. I just want you to see how the numbers greatly vary. So if you look at sort of the county base rate, it's a 0.10 millage. Then compare the county base rate, which is 0.10 or 0.11 if you round it up, to municipal millage rates. So Casey has a millage rate of a 0.04 versus Columbia 0.98. In other words, you have a higher rate of taxation in Columbia as compared to Casey. More than twice the rate. Eastover is 0.120 and Forest Acres is 0.04. Now, we'll go back and think about these particular cities, but why would these cities have this specific millage rate? We'll do a little speculation about that, thinking about the economic standing of the city and how much it feels it can bear or needs to in terms of taxation. Then if we look at school districts, Lexington 5 is 0.27, Richland 1 is 0.29, and Richland 2 is 0.36. And then we can get into sort of the other recreation bonds, recreation commission, other millages sort of not included in the county base rate when we get into our discussion. Here's some special fees, industrial abatements, discuss that, and value of land, 1 mill based on county operations only. This helps determine the county's base rate for comparative analysis. Okay, let's get a little bit more into municipal finances and comparing categories of expenditures between South Carolina cities versus counties. So we're getting very local to have you sort of see it in the perspective of what's true right here in South Carolina. So these two graphs, or these two pie charts, where you're taking, as you know, a 100% and you're divvying it up by category. Might be a little busy, but I wanted to make a comparison here. And what I'm doing is on the left side, you see a pie chart for what's true for cities. So in other words, in various categories of the total, how do cities spend their money? What are their expenditures by category? And what are counties' expenditures by category on the right side? The blue area of each is administration, how much they spend in terms of people they hire to administer the local government. Public safety is orange. Transportation is gray. Health and Human Services is yellow. You can see there is no health and human service expenditures for cities versus counties. Environment and housing expenditures, recreation and culture. Debt services and interest on the debt, which is important. You can see in each is actually about 10 or 11 or 12% of the total budget, and then purchase of land and facilitation construction. So here's the big takeaway I want you to think about relative to these two particular pie charts. We can unpack them more. South Carolina cities spend less on administration as well as health and human services than do counties. But South Carolina counties spend less on public safety as well as recreation and culture than do cities. Let's think about why that might be the case. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about municipal finances and talk a little bit more specifically about taxation, and particularly property taxes, and how property taxes, you can see that cities and counties spend about a third of their budget, a third of their revenue sources come from property taxes, but there are issues with property taxes, okay? So there are numerous problems that result from the reliance of local governments on property taxes. As you can recall from the graphic about 2 slides ago, it has dropped from a high of about 70% in the early 1900s to about 30% today. And so there even with the reliance that local governments have upon property taxes, again, as I'm indicating to you, there are a number of issues. One is, how do you actually tax property, or how do you actually come up with taxation of property? So, real versus personal property. When we use the term real property, I'll explain what I mean. It's easy for local governments to tax real property, or ad valorem, meaning you can physically see land, and you can see various improvements in land. People can't move land around. It's hard for them to move buildings around, or streets, or streetways, or roadways around. Those are things that are physical assets that are going to remain in place. But it's more difficult to tax personal property. How do you come in and tax my chair or my appliances? You can. We do have car taxes. Richland County has like other counties throughout the state, have a car tax. You can tax cars, but again, that's a little less hard. It's harder to pin down. It's harder to keep track of car taxation. Cars move around. You don't, and you have to have, local law enforcement literally stop people to see whether or not they have their registration sticker. But again, frequently people don't move houses. So that's the distinction between the difficulty of real versus personal property taxation. Then exemptions. Now, on one side, certainly if you're concerned about the rates of taxation, and many of us are, it might not be a bad thing that there are a lot of exemptions to the taxation of property. As much as 1/3 of all U.S. real property has exemptions. One major exemption to the taxation of this real property, or there's two major exemptions. One might be that it is actually government-owned land. So the government doesn't tax itself, or it doesn't have a property tax on its own land. So, for instance, here in Columbia, there's a major swath of land that the city of Columbia and the county of Richland cannot tax, and that's Fort Jackson. They can't tax the federal government and the federal land in which it sits upon. And that's a major portion of a major, piece of real estate in the city or the county that goes untaxed. Likewise, because of the Article 1 in the separation of church and state, the federal government local governments, as is true of the federal government, are very careful about the taxation of church property, of religious institutions. And so, these are some of the exemptions that account for that high rate of exemption of property or real estate, real property in the United States. Then, as you can imagine, property taxes are really unpopular. In fact, they're probably among the most unpopular taxes. One survey found 28% of citizens considered it the worst tax of all taxes, as opposed to 27% for federal income taxes. And of course, it's most unpopular the more money you make. The property taxation or property taxes are regressive, and I'm not making a political statement. I'm using this as an economic term. It is regressive in the sense that those with lower incomes pay a relatively higher percentage of their income in property taxes. It's the simple mathematical proposition that if I make a 10% of $1 million, maybe more money than 10% of $10,000, but 10% is a larger. But those who make $1 million can withstand 10% of taxation on their income or on their property, if you will, than 10% of those making $10,000. And then assessment. So different cities can reach very different conclusions about how to assess property values. You can see these millage rates can vary very widely, and you can have really different sets of rules and regulations as to exactly what is taxed and how it is taxed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about municipal financing. Here I'm showing you a really popular aspect of taxation in South Carolina, and we are one of the many states that have tax-free days, meaning that there is a temporary exemption on excise tax, on sales taxes for that particular day. It encourages people to go out and shop because they're not paying as much for the item, because the sales tax for that particular day or set of days is null and void. Then, of course, it kicks right back in after the tax-free day is done. But it encourages people to go out and shop, as you well know. So let's think about sales tax, another form of taxation. The amount of money you pay beyond with each item that you buy, food item or clothing or other items that you buy in the store. 33 states allow local governments to levy local sales taxes. And here in South Carolina, we call it sort of a local tax option, among others. Now, though they are regressive, over the last 30 years, these taxes have been on the upswing. And you can remember from that previous chart that the user fees went up. And sales taxes can be considered as part of those user fees. Income taxes, 16 states allow municipalities to levy income taxes. But controversy has arisen over if and how commuters should pay these taxes, and these taxes have high administration costs. So you can imagine that income taxes are at the state and local level are really unpopular. Because taxpayers will say, well, I'm already paying federal income tax and I'm paying state income tax. Now I got to pay tax to the city of Columbia. So you can imagine how that's not a popular proposition. I know it was true in the Washington, D.C., that Washington, D.C. has a local income tax. But then how do you decide how to tax people? And particularly if people live in one place and they commute to another place each day. They might live, in the case of D.C., in Northern Virginia and drive into the city each day. And so how do you catch folk who are commuting and make them, because their residence is in one place, even though their work is in another? And so it's really kind of hard for cities to be able to, ensure that people are paying these local income taxes. It's a small feat for the federal and state governments to catch people, but you can imagine it's even more of a feat for local government. Then user fees, and I've already talked quite a bit about them, or sort of special assessments as they may be called. They're more popular because you said, well, if you don't want to use the service, if you don't want to pay the tax or the fee, don't use the service. But the problem is that persons who need these services, who most need these services, are least able to pay the fees. For example, higher bus fares for bus riders. You might say, well, we need to expand the bus system, so we're going to increase bus fares. But again, for the people who don't have cars and the bus is their only means of transportation, they are less likely to be able to endure a higher rate than the folk who are more affluent, who are riding in cars and vans. Now, what about sort of a discussion more of intergovernmental revenues? As I stated in a previous lecture, since the 1930s New Deal program, there were direct aid or grant relationships between the federal government and cities. So that these relationships have been key, as you can recall from my previous chart, that federal sources of revenue to cities matter. They might be in less than 10%, but that 10% of a budget can be critically important to a local government. And so we've also talked about this whole concept of revenue sharing. And as you should know from my previous lecture, I think it was topic 7, that revenue sharing has come to an end. But in the 1960s, there emerged sort of general revenue sharing between the federal government and cities. And by the end of the 1970s, and especially by the middle of the 1980s, revenue sharing was eliminated and grant and aid was drastically reduced. That's just a review of what we talked about earlier. Okay, so here I'm showing you on the left side, the 1040 and various other forms that we have to fill out relative to our federal or annual income tax, and folk determine which forms they use based upon what they want to claim in terms of taxation. But on the right side, I'm showing you a license plate from the city of Washington, D.C., and it says taxation without representation. So there's been an ongoing movement in D.C. Remember, D.C. is essentially a federal district. That it doesn't have a state government. The federal government is essentially in control of D.C. But since the early 1970s, the federal government has granted D.C. some degree of home rule. Successive Congresses have differed in to what degree they retract or expand that home rule. And so D.C. residents often talk about the idea that they send a delegate to Congress. They don't have representation in Congress because they're not a state. They send a delegate to Congress who's a non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton for many years, but she doesn't have a vote on the floor of Congress. She is granted some degree of votes in committee, but not in the bills that come before the floor. So how do you balance representation with taxation? It's an ongoing and perennial question that has been asked in American politics and American political thinking. So one question, because of the unpopularity of taxation, is what limits should we put on local taxation? In the 1970s and 1980s, there was an overall trend of middle-class taxpayer rebellions that resulted in state governments placing limitations on city taxation rates. And in particular, in California, there was Proposition 13 in 1978. It rolled back tax rates to 1975 levels and limited annual increases to about 2%. So it was this, you can see that in broad respect, there was this revolt against these local taxes, and they provided a ceiling. Keep in mind that this was the period when it was sort of a double whammy to many cities and counties, because on one side, the federal government, between the 1980s and the 1990s, was drastically reducing its federal revenue sharing and its intergovernmental transfers to local governments. And you had citizens rebelling from what they conceived as the sort of high rates of taxation that were occurring to make up for these losses of federal sources and, quite frankly, state sources as well. And so that's why you saw that those rates of taxation being smaller, or local sources of taxation making up some portion of the budget of some of these Western and Southern governments, but up to some limit. So these are it's an interesting set of binds that governments have had to contend with. Proposition 9 that was put forward was a proposition in California that actually argued for cutting state tax rates by 50%. It was defeated, but it gained some ground of drastically reducing state taxes as well. So now, what has been the municipal response when municipalities have been informed that they've got to roll back their tax rates? They can't tax, income or property, real estate or personal property at the same rates. They simply have had to belt tighten. They've had to do more with less. For example, in 1992 and in the 90s were our particular period of revolt. So you'll see many examples I provide you come from the 1990s. For example, in 1992, DuPage County rolled back tax rates so drastically that they had to start, and this is not unique to them, we've done it in South Carolina, they had no money left for building classrooms. They had to hold expanding numbers of classrooms, or increasing numbers of classrooms, in trailers. They could no longer build sort of permanent physical assets as classroom buildings because they just did not have the money to build. Other methods included developer fees. So municipalities have had to come up with new fees for the construction of new subdivisions. So if you build a new subdivision, we'll put a rate of taxation, or tax increment developing, or tax increment redevelopment, or financing a project through future profits. So saying that, okay, if we give you some degree of subsidy on the front end, we give you some subsidy to build this development as a local government. When you generate some level of revenue, we will tax that rate of revenue that comes in. So these are all sort of innovations, quote unquote, if you will, to kind of deal with these losses in taxation in other colonies. And so now let's get a little more deeply into the woods by way of, we've talked a lot about the revenue side. Now let's talk about the broader income side by talking about when cities have to lend money, or when they lend money from others, from private investors to fund public projects. And here I'm showing you, I thought these were interesting. I found these two copies of local municipal bonds. One from the city of New York, the New York Bridge Bond, around about 1868. You might be a little too young to hear that old joke about people selling parts of the Brooklyn Bridge. But it was in this period of New York of expansive growth and expansive construction, particularly as we got the urban political machines in charge, where the city was issuing municipal bonds. It would loan money from individuals and give them a bond in return, and use these monies for construction projects. True also here in South Carolina, major construction occurring through the issuing of municipal bonds, and that's an example of a 19th century South Carolina municipal bond. Okay, so let's talk about municipal bonds. To plan for and to meet unmet needs, cities have to borrow money. In return for borrowed money, they issue municipal bonds. What is a municipal bond? It's some level of guarantee that they will return the money of a private investor with interest. So we as individual consumers certainly loan money from banks and from lending institutions, and municipalities do the same thing, although they have a range of places where they might lend this money from. One is the issuance of municipal bonds. If you have an investment portfolio, probably some part of your portfolio is includes municipal bonds, because they're a pretty sure bet. They might not have a huge rate of interest, but they're a pretty sure bet in terms of the growth of your investment, of your principal. So what are the categories of municipal bonds? You have tax anticipation notes, TANs. TANs are usually repaid in 30 to 120 days from a city's normal revenues. So that's one form. General obligation bonds. General obligation bonds are backed up by the full faith and credit of government, and it has a legal obligation of repayment. So now TANs means that the city is pretty certain that it's going to be able to pay you back very quickly. 30 to 120 days means that the city is essentially you're essentially floating the city alone. And you know that you'll get your money back. You might not get a huge rate of interest, but you'll get some small portion of interest back, because the city is guaranteed that it's going to pay this money back by virtue of the fact it knows it is pretty certain it has revenues coming in that will be able to pay back that rate of interest. But general obligation bonds, they have a longer period that might be extending over a couple of years, but they are fairly certain bets, because the city has a legal obligation to repay, and cities can go. The only way cities can get out of them is if they declare bankruptcy, which is a very drastic thing for a city to do. Then you have revenue bonds. So revenue bonds are often used to finance the construction of a particular project or repay the investor through future revenues, profit generated for a project. So in building a stadium, in building a festival, in subsidizing the construction of a festival mall, of a hotel complex, of giving some degree of subsidy to a private developer to build a new hotel complex. The city may float a revenue bond, and the revenue bond simply says that when in fact we generate some income from this project, so the income, there might be some income split from how this project is generated, we will repay this bond to you, the private investor, based on that revenue. And then one last category that I'll include here are moral obligation bonds. Now, moral obligation bonds probably have the highest rate of interest that you can generate, but they're greatly risky. There's great risk involved in them. Why? Because they're issued when the city has reached the full indebtedness that state law allows. So they can't by law take on more debt, but they will simply say that we have a moral obligation to give this back to you for our good name. I'm joking about them because I say I double dare swear to pay you back bonds. So there is no guarantee that you will get your money in return or your rate of investment will be increased through these bonds. But if you take the risk, you might get a handsome rate of interest, a handsome dividend from these bonds. So I hope that helped you kind of understand sort of the municipal lending process through bonds. Now, of course, if cities take on bonds, or if they issue bonds, they are in effect taking on debt. They are taking on debt that they have to repay. And again, you remember from the previous chart, somewhere between 11 to 12% of cities and counties, their total budget expenditure is in part from the interest they have to pay on their debt upon the bonds that they have issued to private investors. So if you have debt in the American sort of credit system, you have to have a rating based on that debt. Now, you and I have individual credit ratings, and so do cities. So there are major services that rate cities. Rating agencies such as Moody's Investor Service and Standard & Poor's rate cities annually to recommend their credit worthiness to investors. And for example, the state of South Carolina has a credit rating. The city of Columbia have a credit rating. It might range from AA, AAA to the highest to BBB, the lowest. You don't want a BBB rating because that says that your municipality is very uncreditworthy. It may default on its loans or it has some guarantee of this. But the problem is no one kind of fully understands how these rating agencies come up with their ratings. They're secretive, and sometimes critics say they're subjective and often arbitrary. And so not knowing how to improve their credit ratings, cities sometimes can be at a loss as to how these ratings match up with their actual fiscal performance. And Judd and Swanstrom, a text I have used as an important reference throughout the course, they have a quote in this particular chapter that I thought is intriguing. They said, using objective data about a city's financial condition. So saying, how well a city actually pays back its loans, how much it does, provide bonds that are credit worthy, to what degree it has a budget that is within budget, those types of things. Using those objective financial conditions, it is possible to duplicate the ratings only 50 to 70% of the time. So you can only match Moody's Investor Service and Standard & Poor's 50 to 70% of the time when you use these objective criteria. So what do they use? And it's still a mystery in that regard. And so this means sort of debt repayment is critically important, but how is it critically important? Municipal debt defaults or bankruptcies are extremely rare. Why are they extremely rare? they're not unheard of, but they're extremely rare. Why? I'll explain just very briefly in the sense that no city wants to, like no individual wants to, declare bankruptcy. It's not good for your future lending, the prospects of any future lending, and for the rate of interest you have to pay now. But likewise, many municipalities have a legal obligation to not to be bankrupt. Their cities simply don't permit them to declare bankruptcy. They must be solvent, and they must have budgets that are within budget and only loan up to the rate of lending that they can afford to. So there are legal limits as well as political limits and obligations that cities must meet to not default or to go into bankruptcy. So having said this, let's talk about a few case studies when things went wrong and cities and counties got into a bit of trouble with regards to lending, and someone else had to, or the cities and counties themselves had to figure out how to step in to avert crisis. So I'm showing you here this film, Orange County, because I'm going to talk about Orange County. I'm going to talk about former Mayor Ed Rendell many years ago, when he was the mayor of the city of Philadelphia, who later became the governor of Pennsylvania. And then Mayor Marion Barry, who many years ago was the mayor of Washington, D.C., got into some scandal and some trouble, later ran as a council member of the city of Washington, D.C. All right, so let's look at Orange County. And you'll notice that many of these examples are from the 1990s. And I'm quoting the 1990s particularly because it was a period where cities were struggling with meeting their obligations. But these are examples that we can extend certainly into the 2000s as well, particularly under the Great Recession. So one example is Orange County, California, had an infamous reputation of having to file for Chapter 9 federal bankruptcy protection in 1994. And at that time, it was the largest municipality to declare bankruptcy in the United States. New York City at one point had very similar troubles in terms of bankruptcy in the late 1970s. Orange County lost $2 billion on risky investment strategy. There was the savings and loan crisis that have affected many cities and many private investors. And voters defeated a tax increase proposal. So once the city was getting into debt trouble and things were not paying off and things were going into the red, they tried to turn to the voters to get them out of trouble by way of taxation, and the voters said no. So they had to severely do some severe tightening of the belt and issued new long-term bonds to at least begin to dig themselves out of this hole. Then on the other side of the coast, in Philadelphia, PA, Mayor Ed Rendell faced a $1.5 billion budget deficit in 1991. Now, that's pretty whopping for a city, particularly in the 1990s, to face. That's a lot of debt. And the state government then created a Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Agency and demanded a tough five-year plan. In other words, the state of Pennsylvania essentially put the city of Philadelphia into receivership. A similar process happened to Detroit, Michigan, and the state of Michigan with regards to Detroit. Essentially appointed a financial officer over the city that was responsible for getting the city back into black. So in the case of the Philadelphia example, Mayor Rendell turned to competitive bidding and privatization among other efforts. What did he do? Essentially, privatizing services such as garbage collection, sort of a range of services that took these services off the books of the city budget and placed them in the hands of private companies to provide these services to citizens within the city. Then Washington, D.C., which is an ongoing source of struggle and tension within American local government because of D.C. citizens continuing to clamor about the lack of representation. But Congress placed it under a control board in 1995. So Congress essentially took financial receivership over DC. It had extreme powers, including the ability to approve all budgets in the city, to approve all contracts, all loans, and supervise the city jails and Medicaid system. Even to fire members of the mayor's cabinet and create a new fiscal officer in each department. You have a new fiscal watchdog in each department. This was a huge source of tension between citizens of DC and the national government, who they've said, this is our home rule government, and we contest and disagree with this. Of course, now the other tension was a partisan one. DC is a strongly Democratic city. Democrats make up a huge share of the voters in DC, and at that time, in the mid-90s, both houses of Congress were controlled by the Republicans. So this was yet another source of tension. Anthony Williams, who was the chief financial officer of the city, and the individual who was sort of the budget czar, was the later elected mayor and tightened the belt of the city to create a $130 million surplus. It was not a popular thing, but it was done for issues of financial expediency. But these were hard decisions that are made, and they're not popular decisions. And some would say they even sort of go against home rule and democratic rule. But again, these are the debates around keeping cities in the black. So what do cities do then to promote some degree of investment? How do cities go expand the possible income that they need beyond bonds and beyond taxation? Well, cities want to have a strategy of growth. And so here I'm showing you a chart that is labeled sort of the logic of growth. What's the logic behind cities getting involved with private investors to bring about development? Well, if you start with the first, the first factor, public subsidies. In other words, cities use private investment to stimulate subsidies. They might take community development block grants. They might take city capital development funds. But they say that we want to encourage we want to encourage businesses, we want to encourage entrepreneurs and developers to do the following thing: to come in and to build this mall, to come in and to develop this project. And so they provide some degree of subsidies. It might be we will have delayed taxation in a particular area, or we will not have taxation and we won't tax you on the front end at all, and instead tax revenues that generate from the project. So there's all types of ways they can provide these public subsidies. These public subsidies then create private investment, right? So investors say, okay, well, if the city is going to do the following, it may be worth my while to do X. It may be worth my while to develop this new business campus. It might be worth my while to invest in this particular part of public infrastructure, whatever may be the case. These private investments then help to stimulate the job base, right? And so jobs are created. The more jobs that are created, the greater number of individuals who become taxpayers, and the taxpayer base increases. And then this improves the overall business climate of the city, that the city is known as a city open for business. And this certainly was a strategy that has been taken here in Richland County in the city of Columbia. There's two projects in particular that you probably know a decent amount about, or at least you're aware of. One is the University of South Carolina's Inna Vista Research Park and the Spirit Communications Park, the ballpark of the Columbia Fireflies. They are both projects that were publicly subsidized. Both state, but particularly local funds public funds were used to stimulate private investment, or at least the hope was to create private investment. And they were subsidized ventures that they hoped to attract, in one case of the Inna Vista campus, that roughly 500-acre plot of land that goes as far as Assembly Street and goes down to the Congaree River, a pretty wide swath of land. The idea was to attract high-tech firms into this new research park, to attract high-tech firms and high-tech jobs to locate to this center of innovation and research. And of course, the Columbia Spirit Communications Park was to create not only a ballpark for recreation purposes, but to stimulate commercial development around the park. And they both respectively received at least, initially $60 million in public funding. But have they paid off? I will say on one case with the Innovista Research Park, the project began in 2005. Then the Great Recession hit in 2009. So the degree to which they've been able to attract firms has been a slow process because of the Great Recession. Timing is everything sometimes. Likewise, in the Spirit Communications Park, there was a lot of debate about should that large amount of money go to a ballpark, to a redevelopment of a major area. And there are pros and cons, but there are members of the city council to this day who got elected in opposition to the ballpark, or at least being critical of how quickly the project moved without full public discussion. But Mayor Benjamin, as we know, disagrees with that. He's a major backer behind that ballpark. So the question will be: is it generating the commercial development that one would hope, and bringing businesses around the area, as one would hope, including are there externalities like more traffic that it generates around the area, and critics would say that would be a downside. So these are real considerations. And so, what is urban economic development? It is a process whereby local governments and other public actors sort of induce or entice private actors to economically invest in cities for the purposes of job creation and the stimulation of the local economy. So again, the logic of growth comes into play. Again, public subsidies, remember, stimulate private investments. Then investments create jobs for residents and a healthy tax base. Review, which induces prosperity and a good business climate. This in turn helps to stimulate more private investment and further subsidies. Okay, that's the logic. So what's the problem with this logic? You and I will have that discussion in class about, what might be missing in this logic. And this is a process that has occurred over a number of years. Particularly, it's not a recent question. It's a question that emerged really after the World War II period into the contemporary period of American intergovernmental relations. We've already sort of talked about the issue that many cities in the 1940s and 1950s in particular were taking on issues of urban blight. The idea that, whether it's the problem of air quality and the development of industrial areas and factories, or abandoned buildings and blighted and slum areas within the urban core of the city. So the urban blight was the problem that urban renewal, particularly through the 1949 Housing Act, was tackling. And there were individuals we've already made reference to, so I'm in some way circling back around to the figure of Robert Moses. Robert Moses he had a fairly simple title in the city of New York as sort of redevelopment and housing director. But Robert Moses amassed pretty enormous power in the city of New York. He fundamentally reshaped the city of New York, and did it in a fairly heavy-handed way. Robert Moses was not one who was very open to criticism. He said, to paraphrase him, he says, those who do build, those who criticize sit on the sidelines. So Robert Moses was critical of those who didn't want to see a progressive, growing, and expansive New York City. And there is a large footprint on the city of New York that stems from Robert Moses' heavy-handedness and his direct efforts to reshape the city. We've already talked about the Cross Bronx Expressway. Here I'm showing you a picture of the Cross Bronx Expressway, and you can see that red line where the Cross Bronx Expressway is a connector that literally goes through the heart of the city and through particularly the borough of Bronx. You can't see the Bronx there, but it's in the middle of the picture there. So, drawing that highway literally through the city in the planning in the 1940s and going into the 1950s meant that you cut off the vibrancy of a particular community. And so this was a part of the Bronx, a very ethnically diverse working class segment of the city, but you were literally drawing a canyon between neighborhoods. You see the apartment buildings on both sides with this canyon, this huge swath of a canyon in the middle where the highway will go. And the Bronx for many years, suffered as a result of this sort of bisecting these ethnically diverse working class neighborhoods. And I think I've told you before, in fact, the whole emergence of the cultural form and music of hip-hop music emerged in the Bronx because of the economic poverty and devastation that occurred, partly because of the blindsidedness of Moses in creating that expressway that cut off the vital economic areas of the city and divided those neighborhoods in half. So, as partly what occurred in the 1950s and 1940s was the beginning of local growth coalitions. And this will set the groundwork for me to conclude with a further discussion of urban regimes. In the 1940s and 1950s, the flight of businesses and taxpayers to the suburbs concerned a new generation of reform politicians. They were concerned about the level of the things occurring and facing cities in the 1940s and 50s. So they were trying to tackle problems of pollution, problems of transportation, grids and systems that were clogged, that highways and roadways where there was too much traffic and there was a lack of planning in terms of traffic. There were slum conditions, impoverished neighborhoods right at the center of the city, suffering from poor housing and poor sanitation after many years of neglect. And so urban blight was attacked by these politicians and the corporate civic elite. For instance, in the city of Pittsburgh, there was the Pittsburgh Allegheny Conference on Community Development. This sort of Pittsburgh Allegheny Conference on Community Development would be part of what we talked about as an urban regime, of bringing together of corporate, civic, and political elites to create a new growth coalition. Or the Greater Baltimore Committee, or the Cleveland Development Foundation, all of them being examples of groups of elites, groups of leaders coming together to promote sort of new urban growth. And urban renewal, just to reiterate, was Title I of the 1949 Housing Act, or the urban renewal that targeted predominantly residential areas or other blighted areas through slum clearance and the provision of affordable housing. And although this redevelopment may have had a positive spinoff for central businesses, Heford notes that its housing focus was not meant for wholesale redevelopment of downtowns. So cities kind of expanded the use of these slum clearance and affordable housing provisions, really to try to cultivate a more middle and income class community, not necessarily to redevelop them for the benefit of the working class that often live in these neighborhoods. So local redevelopment kind of can come into contrast with urban renewal. Thus, some of the most publicized redevelopment efforts were done through public-private partnerships as opposed to federal assistance. So it was not always federal assistance that mattered, and federal assistance was key, but federal assistance might have stimulated discussions about other efforts at redevelopment as spinoffs to those partnerships. So there are upsides and downsides to economic development. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Let me give you a few examples in this regard. Baltimore's Harbor Place, Baltimore's Harbor Place is a festival market in Baltimore, Maryland that opened in July the 2nd, 1980. It's a centerpiece of the revival of downtown Baltimore. As it suggests, it's located in the inner harbor of the city of Baltimore, Maryland. And Harbor Place is composed of two-story pavilions, the Pratt Street Pavilion and the Light Street Pavilion. Each of these buildings contains dozens of stores and restaurants. Many of the stores sell merchandise specific to Baltimore, the state of Maryland, such as the Blue Food Crab products, Baltimore Orioles and Ravens merchandise, etc. And Baltimore Harbor Place, as developed by James Rouse and the Rouse Company, was considered pretty much a success in many regards in revitalizing downtown Baltimore. But not all of Baltimore. There was a mix. It was many critics of this effort of focusing these redevelopment dollars downtown. There's now sort of the National Harbor Project as extending to the larger Washington-Baltimore area. That is sort of another effort to stimulate growth and to do economic development. Another example of economic development, let me not get ahead of myself, is the Detroit Renaissance Center, the Renaissance Center. It is a group of 7 interconnected skyscrapers in downtown Detroit, Michigan. Located on the International Riverfront, the Renaissance Center complex is owned by General Motors and is its world headquarters. The central tower of the Detroit Marriott at the Renaissance Center is the second tallest all-hotel skyscraper in the Western Hemisphere and features the largest rooftop restaurant. The insignia has been the tallest building in Michigan since it was erected in 1977. And John Portman was its principal architect for the original design. In 2004, General Motors completed a $500 million or $500 million renovation of the Class A Center as its world headquarters, which it purchased in 1996. So the Renaissance Center, again, another example of economic development that helped to eventually stimulate economic development in the downtown area. In Detroit, there's now the campus Martis complex and various other spin-offs of economic development in that downtown area as a result. But again, there was debate because of what the city of Detroit was facing about the focusing of these redevelopment dollars downtown, particularly given the economic crisis that neighborhoods have undergone in Detroit. Now, when development doesn't quite go right, might be example of the Atlanta Peachtree Plaza, opened as the tallest building in the southeastern United States, surpassing One Shell Square in New Orleans. It lost its title in 1983 with the Southern Financial Center in Miami surpassed it, and it was the tallest building in downtown Atlanta for 13 years. The hotel was heavily featured in the 1981 film Sharky's Machine starring Burt Reynolds. And there are a number number of ways in which this hotel plaza was initially seen as an effort to stimulate growth in downtown Atlanta. However, Atlanta has undergone a process of urban sprawl, so that soon this complex, particularly in the 1990s, found levels of abandonment in not only this hotel, but the underground complex nearby, where the city had to rethink, was this really drawing people downtown, or were people really kind of being more dispersed outwards to places like the Lenox Mall and malls in the Buckhead area. So it didn't initially draw folk downtown as was the expectation. And didn't pan off initially in ways as anticipated. And a really important example of when development kind of goes wrong was the St. Petersburg Suncoast Dome, or the Tropicana Field. It was a dome stadium in St. Petersburg, Florida, United States, that has been the home of the Tampa Bay Rays of Major League Baseball since the team's inaugural season in 1998. The stadium was used for college football, and since December 2008 has been the home of the St. Petersburg Bowl, an annual postseason major bowl game. But keep in mind, it became the home of the Tampa Bay Rays in 1998. But the Tropicana Field opened in 1990, 8 years earlier. It was originally known as the Florida Suncoast Dome, or I'm calling it the St. Peter's Dome. In 1993, the Tampa Bay Lightning moved to the facility and its name was changed to the Thunderdome. The problem, however, is that the Suncoast Dome, it was built in 1990 with the hope of luring the Chicago White Sox to relocate there. They didn't come. So they built it, but the team didn't come. And they simply upgraded Comiskey Park. So from 1990 to roughly 1998, you had this principally vacant, huge stadium complex in the middle of St. Petersburg, Florida. And some were sort of seen it as a white elephant. That literally it was sitting there, and though there was some limited use of this complex, it was a huge liability upon the city budget. And was not stimulating the economic development that one would anticipate given that. So sometimes cities can build it and folks do not come. So it's really important to think about how cities work through the process of development and how they attract individuals, tourists, and business travelers to the cities. And cities confront a particular problem called tourist bubbles. They are areas that are so self-contained that tourists and business travelers are not encouraged to go outside them and patronize other parts of the city or region. So they're so self-contained, you can do everything you want to do and recreate the time that you spend in the city, and then you leave these tourist bubbles and go back out. You don't have spillover effects to going to restaurants, to going to other parks or museums. You stay right in that area. So, the examples of tourist bubbles might be hotel and convention centers. As a business traveler and as a professional researcher, I know I've gone to many conferences where all I've seen of a city is the hotel and restaurants nearby. And so that doesn't encourage sort of a spillover effect of other parts of the city redounding from that travel. Theme parks, of course, are famously known for that. You go to the theme park not to go view the larger city, but to go specifically for that purpose. Or as you can imagine, that would also be true of resorts or hotel or casino complexes or festival malls or even stadiums. Again, they encourage people to go just for that purpose, just to that area, and not a spillover effect to local business elsewhere. And so it's the hope to kind of concentrate these dollars. So why do cities build them? Well, they want to stem the flight of inner-city businesses and industries, and so the cities see tourist bubbles as a means to sort of stimulate new dollars in concentrated areas of the cities. Atlanta's Underground is a hope to do just that with that particular complex. Or Boston's Quincy Market, or New York's South Street Seaport. All of them with the hope that if you created these bubbles, people will come. They work out sometimes they do not pan out. And it's the overall struggle that cities have relative to downtown economies. While tourism enhances a city's image, critics often note that sports stadiums and convention centers and other components of the recreation and tourist infrastructure, they don't always pay off. And I gave you some examples of when they don't pay off. And then, of course, casinos have the particular additional element that they can stimulate crime. So there are sort of these negative externalities, as economists would call them, that there are bad things that can be brought in attracting dollars. When you literally have people having wads of cash in their pockets as they walk out of a business establishment, you can imagine how that might stimulate, but certainly attract some level of crime. Okay, so let's end this lecture by revisiting urban regimes. And one of the seminal books on urban regimes is the book by Clarence Stone, Regime Politics in Atlanta. And I want to give you sort of 3 examples of urban regimes. In each case, a different type of urban regime. The urban regime of Mayor Dennis Archer of Detroit, the urban regime of Mayor Michael Flynn of Boston, and the urban regime of Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York. So, again, what is an urban regime? This is just a recap. We've already talked about it pretty extensively. An urban regime is an informal governing coalition comprised of a city's public officials, networks of corporate elites, and civic elites whose chief goal is economic development or economic growth. Such groups might sit upon development downtown boards. They might help comprise planning commissions and encourage private partnerships or special growth committees. And there are typologies or types of regimes. What might be a liberal regime? Liberal regimes seek an informal coalition in order to redistribute, but not fundamentally change the benefits the upper class derive from economic development. So Mayor Dennis Archer was seen as, he was a Democrat, a Democratic mayor, but he was sort of seen as a sort of liberal to moderate mayor, trying to strike a balance between some limited degree of bringing these dollars in to not completely displace the poor and the working class. But the argument is that part of his growth agenda did have some displacement to it. And so a liberal regime tries to strike a balance, if you will, but how much it strikes that balance is an issue. A progressive regime seeks an informal coalition balance between grassroots, community-based interest and corporate elites in order to redistribute the benefits of economic development. In other words, to really bring about some degree of what these proponents might say are economic fairness in creating growth. So Michael Flynn of Boston maybe had a progressive regime. Flynn had a provision where they used eminent domain powers of the cities to actually hand vacant properties, sort of landlords who had neglected their properties in downtowns and simply let them go into ruin, to reclaim these vacant properties and redistributed these vacant properties to economic development corporations, to grassroots community-based corporations whose intent was to bring about new development. And so handing these properties over to these community-based organizations that had the intent of bringing about greater development. The Dudley Street Initiative was one such initiative that would be an example of a partnership in a progressive regime. Conservative regime seeks to create an elite informal coalition dedicated to maintaining the business upper classes derived from economic development. Now, this is a criticism, certainly determine whether it's fair or not, of Mayor Rudolph Giuliani of New York, of Giuliani making a case for creating new stadium projects in New York and the redevelopment after 9/11. To what degree was it the redevelopment, a displacement of working class and low income interest within the city? And that was a critique given of Giuliani, of being sort of heavy-handed in one way versus another. So these are all debates, and they're all debates whether or not these mayors were liberal, progressive, or conservative in their approaches. But these are debates about the various regime typologies. So when we're revisiting urban regimes, in the top corner there, I'm showing you sort of the interlocking business directorate or interlocking corporate relations between various corporations, and at the very center, the corporation of Citigroup, the major lending and banking corporation of Citigroup. And you can see all of the various other nodes in that network are individuals who sit on the boards of those corporations and also sit on the board of Citigroup. So there's a certain overlapping or interlocking degree of dependence between one board of directors of one corporation and another. And I show you that because this network is a corporate example of a regime, but an urban regime would sort of do the same thing, that you have various interlocking ways in which corporate heads, civic, and political elites sit or are part of one development effort, but are connected to another informally. So Central Atlanta Progress, the Atlanta Downtown Improvement District, or the West Palm Beach Downtown Development Authority, or the Frisco Economic Development Corporation. Though they have a very specific public or quasi-public purpose, the groups or individuals who sit on their boards might sit on other major corporate and or economic development coalition boards. And thus there is this sort of interconnectedness that creates up this informal coalition. They're not formally connected, like Citigroup's not formally connected to Pepsi, but members of PepsiCo's board might sit on the Citigroup board and thus create a certain sense of connection in between these boards. So what are the critiques of urban regimes? One is that urban regime may be structural functionalist. Now, when I say critiques of urban regime theory, I'm saying that in some respects, to Clarence Stone, who is a major innovator of this theory, the argument is Stone simply describing the world as it is or the world as it should be? Now, Clarence Stone would argue his theory argued the world as it is, not the world as it should be. But again, critics of the urban regime theory say it assumes capacity to develop its only meaningful evidence of a regime. Regimes are what regimes do. In other words, if they get things done, they're a regime. If they don't get things done, they're not a regime. Remember my discussion of the city of New Orleans, that New Orleans didn't have an urban regime was one critique. The critique that Burns leveled against it or previous authors leveled against it. Is that true? Did they simply have a weak regime or a regime dedicated to a particular purpose, not a non-existent regime? So that's one critique. How do you know you have a regime? Is it only because regimes can get things accomplished that they exist? Secondly, does it sort of under-theorize the role of civic elites? It presumes social production versus social control. In other words, it says, well, regimes do these things in order to get things done. They're not in the business of simply trying to be dominant and control things, but is being able to get this development project off the ground, to create this major outcome that changes the commercial or industrial face of the city. Is that a form of political dominance or political control? This widespread agreement by influential community leaders may sanction corporate-centered growth agenda and thus stifle opposition. Is it, in fact, the case that community organizations may be connected into the regime in ways that then make it the problem that when community leaders or community interest might be better served by some degree of pushback, they're not. That community leaders have been co-opted into as part of the regime. And thus there isn't a constructive tension between neighborhood interest and development interest. In other words, community leaders being bought off might be one sort of the plain way to say it. Is regime theory too elite actor centered and does not account for structure or the dynamics of economy that establish conditions? Communities may be actors in absence of government leadership. In other words, do communities get things done? Community development corporations or various community-based organizations, are they able to get things done even though they're not as directly funded by government sources or government leadership? Is the government leadership always required in order to get things done? And can you do it for community-based efforts, not just simply for that which serves more affluent or wealthy interest? So this is the end of this lecture, and actually it's the end of all my lectures in this class. If you've completed all these up to topic 8 and 9, you've completed all lectures I'm doing in this class. I hope you found this particular lecture interesting. I know it went a little long, but I hope it really gives you a lot of context as we go into our SimCity simulation and think through real world problems relative to economic development and public financing. Thank you much, and be well.